Hey there! Tonight we journey northward to explore the social customs and daily lives of the ancient Nordic peoples. The Vikings and their ancestors who lived across Scandinavia between roughly 800 and 1100 CE developed complex social structures, marriage traditions, and domestic arrangements that shaped every aspect of their existence. These practices, often misunderstood or sensationalized in modern popular culture, reveal sophisticated societies with nuanced approaches to relationships, family formation, and community life. Before settling in, take a moment to like this exploration if the topic interests you, and perhaps share in the comments where in the world you're tuning in from. It's always wonderful to connect with fellow history enthusiasts who appreciate careful historical inquiry. Now, get comfortable, and let's journey together through the fascinating social world of ancient Scandinavia. When thinking about Vikings, minds often drift toward raids, longships, and warriors. But the vast majority of Nordic people lived as farmers, traders, and craftspeople whose daily existence centered on family, community, and the seasonal rhythms of northern life. Understanding their social customs, marriage practices, and domestic arrangements provides essential context for comprehending how these societies actually functioned. The Norse peoples left behind rich archaeological evidence, extensive sagas and poems, legal codes, and runic inscriptions that preserve information about their social practices. While these sources have limitations and biases, careful scholarly analysis can reconstruct much about how ancient Scandinavians approached relationships, formed families, and organized their domestic lives. The social structures governing intimate relationships in Norse society differed significantly from both earlier Germanic traditions and the Christian European societies that eventually absorbed Scandinavia. The Norse developed their own approaches to courtship, marriage, household organization, and family life that reflected their values, environment, and cultural priorities. Understanding these practices requires examining multiple dimensions: the legal frameworks that structured relationships, the social expectations that shaped behavior, the economic realities that influenced decisions, the religious beliefs that provided meaning, and the practical arrangements of daily life. Tonight's exploration examines all these aspects, building a comprehensive picture of how ancient Nordic peoples approach some of life's most fundamental human experiences. So let's begin where any understanding of Norse social life must start, with the legal and social frameworks that structured relationships and defined what was considered proper and acceptable behaviour in these northern societies. Ancient Nordic societies operated under sophisticated legal systems that addressed relationships, marriage, family formation, and domestic arrangements with remarkable detail. Understanding these legal frameworks provides essential foundation for comprehending how social customs actually functioned in practice. The Norse legal tradition emphasized oral law preserved and recited by legal specialists called law speakers. These individuals memorized extensive legal codes covering everything from property disputes to marriage regulations. At regular assemblies called things, communities gathered to address legal matters, hear cases, and make collective decisions. The thing system represented remarkably democratic governance for its time. Marriage in Norse society constituted legal contract as much as personal relationship. The arrangements involved negotiations between families, exchange of property, and formal procedures that created legally recognized unions. These contracts protected rights and established obligations for both parties, their families, and any children born from the union. The betrothal process, called festa, involved formal negotiations between families. The prospective groom's family would approach the bride's family to propose the match and discuss terms. These negotiations addressed the munda, bride price paid by groom's family to bride's father or guardian, and the heimanfylgja, dowry the bride brought to the marriage from her family. The munda represented significant economic transaction. The amount varied based on social status and economic circumstances, but typically consisted of valuable goods, livestock, land, or precious metals. This payment compensated the bride's family for losing her labour while ensuring she entered marriage with resources providing some economic security. The heimanfylgja, contrary to some interpretations, remained the bride's property. While her husband managed it during marriage, she retained ownership and could reclaim it if the marriage dissolved. This arrangement provided women with economic protection and some degree of independence unusual for the medieval period. The wedding ceremony itself, bryllup, combined pagan religious elements with legal formalization and community celebration. The ceremony typically occurred at the bride's family home and involved sacrifices to gods seeking their blessing, exchange of swords or other symbolic gifts, and the formal joining of two families through the couple's union. Witnesses played crucial roles in Norse weddings. The presence of respected community members who could later testify to the marriage's legitimacy ensured legal recognition. These witnesses participated in the ceremony and feast, cementing their role as guarantors of the union's validity. The wedding feast following the ceremony could last for days and involved extensive hospitality. Hosts provided food, drink and entertainment for guests who came to celebrate and witness the union. These feasts served social functions beyond mere celebration, creating and reinforcing social networks through shared festivities. Consent, at least theoretically, mattered in Norse marriage law. While arranged marriages were common and family interests heavily influenced decisions, the sagas preserve accounts of women and men who refused proposed matches. The extent to which theoretical legal protections translated into practical autonomy varied based on social status, family dynamics, and individual circumstances. The legal age for marriage reflected practical considerations about readiness for household management and childbearing rather than fixed numerical standards. Generally, women married in their late teens or early 20s, while men typically married slightly later, after establishing households and acquiring resources necessary to support families. Polygyny, the practice of men having multiple wives simultaneously, appears in some saga accounts, though its prevalence remains debated among scholars. The practice, if it occurred, likely remained restricted to wealthy men of high status, who could afford to maintain multiple households and meet corresponding obligations. Concubinage represented another relationship category in Norse society. Men might maintain formal relationships with women beyond legal wives, with these relationships carrying some recognition, though less than marriage. Children from these unions could inherit and bore less stigma than in later Christian Europe, though their rights remained secondary to those of legitimate offspring. Divorce in Norse society occurred with relative frequency compared to Christian medieval Europe. Either party could initiate divorce for various reasons, including abuse, neglect, economic failure, or incompatibility. The process involved formal declaration before witnesses and division of property according to original marriage agreements. The grounds for divorce reflect cultural values and priorities. Women could divorce husbands who dressed too effeminately, who failed to provide adequately, or who committed serious insults. Men could divorce wives for adultery, for wearing masculine clothing, or for other breaches of gender norms. These divorce grounds reveal much about Norse conceptions of proper gender behaviour. Property division following divorce protected both parties' interests to some degree. Women reclaimed their heimanfylgja and often received additional compensation. Men retained property they brought to marriage and acquired during it. Clear property separation in Norse marriage law facilitated relatively clean divorces compared to systems where marital property merged indistinguishably. Remarriage after divorce or death of spouse occurred commonly and carried little stigma. The practical necessities of household management in agricultural society meant that adults typically needed partners to divide labour effectively. Widows and widowers remarried frequently, often quickly after a spouse's death. Children's rights and obligations formed another major area of Norse family law. Legitimate children inherited from both parents, with sons typically receiving larger shares reflecting their roles as future household heads. Daughters received inheritances including land and goods that formed their dowries when they married. Inheritance laws protected children's interests even when marriages dissolved. Fathers remained obligated to support their children regardless of marital status. This legal obligation ensured that children's welfare didn't depend solely on intact marriages, providing social safety net unusual for the period. Guardianship laws addressed situations where children lost parents, or where women lacked male relatives to represent their interests legally. These provisions appointed guardians responsible for protecting wards' property and interests until they reached maturity or married. The concept of self-ownership appears in Norse law regarding relationships and marriage. While social pressures and economic realities constrained choices, the legal tradition acknowledged individual rights in ways that differentiated Norse society from many contemporary cultures, where women particularly lacked legal personhood. slavery's existence complicated the legal landscape significantly. Enslaved people, called thralls, lacked legal rights to marriage or family formation. Relationships between free and enslaved persons carried social stigma and created complex legal situations regarding any children produced. The legal frameworks around intimate relationships reflected broader Norse values: emphasis on honour, concern for property rights, recognition of family interests, and pragmatic approaches to social organisation. These laws structured how people formed relationships, created families, and organised their domestic lives throughout the Norse world. The actual practices surrounding marriage in Norse society combined legal requirements with rich cultural traditions, religious observances, and social customs that varied somewhat across regions and time periods while maintaining core similarities throughout Scandinavia. The courtship period preceding formal betrothal negotiations allowed young people some opportunity to become acquainted, though the extent varied by social class and family circumstances. Public gatherings, seasonal festivals, and community work events provided supervised contexts where unmarried individuals could interact and potentially develop preferences for partners. Gift-giving during courtship followed established customs. Young men might present carved objects, jewellery, or other tokens to women who interested them. These gifts, while modest compared to later bridal payments, signalled interest and began the social process that might lead to formal betrothal negotiations. The role of skalds, professional poets, in courtship appears in saga accounts. Skilled poets might compose verses praising particular women's beauty or virtues. These love poems, while formalised and following traditional structures, allowed expression of personal preference within culturally acceptable frameworks. The importance of family approval cannot be overstated. While personal preferences might influence eventual matches, families made final decisions based on economic considerations, social status, political alliances, and practical assessments of whether proposed unions would benefit both families. Young people understood that marriage involved families joining as much as individuals uniting. The betrothal negotiations themselves followed established protocols. Representatives from both families met to discuss terms, typically at the bride's family home. These negotiations addressed economic arrangements, but also character assessments, family histories, and practical considerations about where the couple would reside and how they would support themselves. The time between betrothal and wedding varied, but typically extended several months to a year. This period allowed families to prepare economically for the wedding feast expenses and gather resources for the new household. The delay also provided time for the couple to become better acquainted before the wedding. Pre-wedding preparations involved extensive work by both families. The bride's family prepared her trousseau, the goods and furnishings she would bring to the marriage. The groom's family prepared the household where the couple would reside, whether a new building or section of existing family home. The bride's preparation for wedding day followed specific customs. She bathed in ritual fashion, often with married women from her family assisting. This bath symbolised the transition from maiden to wife, and involved prayers or charms seeking fertility and marital happiness. The bridal crown, an important element of wedding attire, signified the bride's virginal status. This elaborate headdress, often made of gilt metal and decorated with intricate patterns, represented one of the most valuable items a family owned, and was carefully preserved for use by multiple generations. The groom's preparation involved his own ritual bath and dressing in fine clothing that displayed his family's wealth and status. The exchange of swords during the ceremony held special significance for grooms, as swords represented masculine honour and the responsibilities of household headship. The wedding ceremony timing often aligned with seasonal considerations. Summer weddings took advantage of good weather and abundant food supplies. Some families preferred autumn weddings after harvest, when resources were most plentiful. Winter weddings, while less common, occurred when other timing factors outweighed seasonal disadvantages. The ceremony itself combined multiple elements. Religious sacrifices to gods, particularly Freya, associated with love and fertility, sought divine blessing for the union. The exchange of items symbolising the couple's new relationship formalised the marriage. Witnesses observed and could later attest to the marriage's validity. The exchange of rings during Norse weddings, while not universal, appears in some accounts. These rings, often elaborate and valuable, symbolised the binding nature of marriage vows and served as visible markers of married status. The practice may have become more common over time. particularly as Christian influence increased. The wedding feast represented the ceremony's most elaborate element. Hosts provided abundant food and drink for guests who might number in the dozens or even hundreds, depending on families' social status. Roasted meats, bread, vegetables, and especially mead or ale flowed freely during celebrations that could extend for several days. Entertainment at wedding feasts included music, storytelling, and various games or contests. Skalds recited poems praising the couple and their families. Musicians played instruments including lyres, flutes, and drums. The festive atmosphere celebrated not just the couple, but the joining of two families and strengthening of community bonds. The bride-running custom, documented in some regions, involved the bride symbolically fleeing to her family's home, with the groom pursuing to capture her. This ritualized chase, more playful than threatening, symbolized the marriage's creation of new primary loyalty from the bride to her husband, superseding her childhood family loyalties. The morning after gift, Morgan Gifu, represented an important custom. The groom presented his bride with valuable gifts, often including jewellery or land that became her personal property. This gift, given after the marriage's consummation, provided the wife with additional economic security and acknowledged her new status. Bedding ceremonies, where the community escorted the couple to the marriage bed with much joking and celebration, appear in some sources. These customs, serving to mark the marriage's consummation and ensure witnesses to its completion, reflected the public nature of marriage as social institution rather than merely private relationship. The integration of the bride into her new household involved rituals marking her acceptance into a new family. She might participate in ceremonies at the household's religious shrine, present offerings to protective spirits, and formally assume responsibilities for household management under the guidance of her mother-in-law if moving into an extended family home. Regional variations in wedding customs reflected Scandinavia's geographic diversity. Coastal communities incorporated different traditions than inland agricultural regions. Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, and Icelandic customs showed variations while sharing fundamental similarities that marked them as part of common Norse cultural tradition. The Christianization of Scandinavia gradually transformed wedding practices. Christian ceremonies began replacing or supplementing pagan rites. Church blessings became expected, and Christian concepts about marriage's indissolubility conflicted with earlier divorce traditions. This transition period saw hybrid practices combining traditional Norse customs with Christian elements. The expense of proper weddings created challenges for poorer families. While wealthy families hosted elaborate multi-day feasts, modest families celebrated more simply, while still observing essential customs. Community support sometimes helped poorer families meet minimum standards for respectable weddings. The wedding tradition served multiple functions beyond celebrating a couple's union. They formalized legal contracts, transferred property, created and strengthened alliances between families, entertained and fed communities, reinforced social hierarchies, and marked important life transitions. Understanding these multiple functions helps explain the elaborate nature of Norse wedding customs. Once married, couples established households that served as fundamental social and economic units in Norse society. Understanding how these households functioned illuminates daily life and the practical realities of marriage in ancient Scandinavia. The typical Norse household centered on the longhouse, a rectangular wooden structure housing family members, sometimes enslaved workers, and occasionally livestock. These buildings varied in size from modest structures for poor families to elaborate halls for wealthy households, but the basic design remained consistent across Norse regions. The interior organisation of longhouses reflected social hierarchies and functional divisions. The high seat, positioned centrally and associated with household heads, represented the most honoured location. Family members' sleeping areas occupied side benches along walls. Work areas for food preparation, textile production, and crafts filled remaining spaces. The hearth, positioned centrally in most longhouses, served multiple crucial functions. It provided heat during long northern winters, light for work during dark months, and cooking facilities for preparing meals. The hearth represented the household's literal and symbolic heart, and its maintenance was essential to survival. Gender roles within households followed clear patterns. Men typically handled outdoor work including farming, animal husbandry, hunting, fishing, and trading. Women managed indoor spaces, overseeing food preparation, textile production, childcare and household management. These divisions, while clear in principle, showed flexibility in practice based on necessity and circumstance. The mistress of the household, the housewife, held significant authority over domestic spheres. She controlled resources allocated to household management, directed enslaved or hired workers in domestic tasks, and made daily decisions about food preparation, textile production, and numerous other matters. Her competence directly affected household prosperity. Keys symbolised the housewife's authority. The mistress carried keys to storerooms, chests, and other secured spaces where valuable goods were kept. These keys, often buried with women, represented their control over household resources and their essential roles in family economic management. Textile production occupied enormous amounts of women's time and represented crucial economic activity. Women spun thread, wove cloth, and created garments for family members. The clothing production process, from processing raw wool or flax through finished garments, involved multiple steps and required skilled labour. Food preparation and preservation consumed significant household labour. Women oversaw food storage, planned meals, prepared daily food, and managed crucial preservation activities, including drying, smoking, salting, and fermenting. These preservation techniques allowed households to survive long winters when fresh food was unavailable. The dairy production that characterised Norse agriculture fell primarily under women's management. Processing milk into cheese, butter, and other preserved dairy products required skill and regular attention. These dairy products provided essential nutrition and represented valuable trade goods. Children's integration into household work began early. Young children helped with simple tasks appropriate to their abilities. As they matured, boys increasingly worked alongside fathers, learning masculine skills while girls worked with mothers learning domestic crafts. This apprenticeship within families transmitted essential knowledge across generations. The elderly maintained roles in households as long as health permitted. Grandparents contributed wisdom, storytelling that preserved family and cultural history, and assistance with lighter household tasks. Their experience made them valuable household members even when they could no longer perform heavy labour. Enslaved workers, when present, performed various household and agricultural tasks under direction of household heads. The number of enslaved workers indicated wealth and status. These individuals lived within the household, typically in areas that reflected their subordinate status, and their labour significantly contributed to household productivity. Meal patterns followed practical rhythms. Morning meals, eaten after early chores, provided sustenance for the day's work. Evening meals, the primary daily gathering, brought household members together after work concluded. These shared meals reinforced family bonds and provided occasions for discussion and decision-making. The food itself varied seasonally and by household wealth. Grain products including bread and porridge formed dietary staples. Preserved fish and meat supplemented grains. Dairy products provided important nutrition. Vegetables, fruits, and nuts added variety when available. Wealthy households enjoyed more diverse diets than poor families surviving primarily on basic staples. Hygiene practices, while different from modern standards, reflected concern for cleanliness. Regular bathing, often weekly, occurred in bathhouses or heated rooms. Hair grooming, attention to clothing cleanliness, and basic hygiene marked respectable household management. Poor hygiene indicated household disorder. Sleep arrangements reflected both practical considerations and social structures. Families slept on benches along longhouse walls, often in family groups. Bedding, including furs, wool blankets, and filled mattresses, provided warmth. Curtains or wooden partitions sometimes created privacy, though the concept meant less than in modern contexts. Evening activities before sleep included craft work continuing by firelight, storytelling that preserved oral traditions and entertained household members, strategy games including nefertafel, and social conversation. These evening hours, particularly during long winter nights, provided opportunities for family bonding and cultural transmission. The household economy operated as an integrated unit with multiple income sources. Agricultural production provided primary sustenance and trade goods. Craft production created items for household use and potential sale. Trading activities brought in goods the household couldn't produce. All family members' labour contributed to overall household prosperity. Seasonal patterns structured household activities. Spring meant planting, sheep shearing, and renewed outdoor activities after winter. Summer involved intensive agricultural work, trading voyages, and long working hours maximising daylight. Autumn brought harvest and preparations for winter. Winter focused on indoor craft production, equipment maintenance, and minimal outdoor work. Religious observances within households maintained relationships with divine forces and protective spirits. Household shrines honoured gods and ancestors. Seasonal celebrations marked agricultural cycles. These religious practices, integrated into daily life, provided meaning and sought divine favour for household prosperity. Conflict resolution within households ideally occurred through discussion and negotiation. Household heads arbitrated disputes among family members. When conflicts couldn't be resolved internally, families might appeal to broader kinship networks or ultimately to community things for judgment. Guest hospitality represented important social obligation. Norse culture highly valued generous treatment of guests, and households competed to demonstrate their hospitality. Guests received food, drink, and lodging according to household means. This hospitality created and maintained social networks essential to survival and prosperity. The life cycle of households progressed through stages. Newly married couples established households and began families. Growing families with young children focused on child rearing, alongside economic activities. Mature households with adult children represented peak productivity. Elderly couples whose children had established independent households downsized and eventually transferred household headship to the next generation. Household dissolution occurred through death of heads, divorce, or family division. When households dissolved, property division followed established legal customs. New households formed from old ones, maintaining continuity across generations while adapting to changing circumstances. Norse society maintained distinct gender roles with clear expectations about masculine and feminine behaviour, yet the practical realities of life in harsh northern environments created more complexity and flexibility than rigid prescriptions might suggest. Masculinity in Norse culture centred on concepts of warrior prowess, honour, household headship, and productive labour. Men gained status through demonstrated courage in battle, success in trading or raiding, effective household management, and maintenance of family honour. The ideal man excelled in multiple domains rather than specialising in single pursuits. The warrior identity, while culturally central, applied primarily to certain periods of men's lives and particular social contexts. Most men spent the majority of their time on farming, fishing, or crafts rather than warfare. However, the ability and willingness to fight when necessary remained expected of free men. Honour, a central masculine value, required constant defence. Insults to a man's honour demanded a response, or the man risked being considered weak or cowardly. This honour culture created social pressures that sometimes escalated minor disputes into serious conflicts. Men navigated constant tension between maintaining honour and avoiding destructive feuds. Beards symbolised masculinity and maturity. Adult men grew beards and maintained them carefully. References to beards appear throughout Norse literature, and insults involving beards represented serious affronts. Beard-related insults implied that a man was effeminate or failed to meet masculine standards. Men's clothing reflected practical needs and gender norms. Tunics, trousers, cloaks, and various leather goods comprised typical masculine attire. Colours, quality of materials, and decorative elements indicated status. Cross-dressing or wearing clothing associated with opposite gender could constitute serious insult and grounds for divorce or other social sanctions. Femininity centred on household management competence, fertility, loyalty, and textile production skill. Women gained respect through effective household management, raising healthy children, producing quality textiles, and maintaining family honour through proper behaviour. Women's authority within domestic spheres was real and recognised. The housewife's decisions about resource allocation, food preparation, textile production, and household organisation went largely unchallenged. This domestic authority, while circumscribed to particular domains, represented genuine power in areas that directly affected daily life. Fertility represented highly valued feminine quality. Women who bore healthy children, particularly sons who would continue family lines, earned respect. Conversely, infertility caused anxiety and could strain marriages, though legal frameworks didn't always treat it as grounds for divorce. Textile production skill demonstrated feminine competence and contributed significantly to household economy. Women who produced exceptional textiles gained reputations for skill. These textiles served practical purposes, but also represented status markers and valuable trade goods. Women's dress included long gowns, apron dresses fastened with decorative brooches, head coverings for married women, and various accessories. The quality of materials, skilled construction, and decorative elements all communicated status and resources. Married women's head coverings signified their married status and differentiated them from unmarried women. The concept of ergi, a complex term encompassing unmanliness or feminine behaviour in men, represented serious insult. Accusations of ergi implied that a man took passive roles in intimate relationships or generally behaved effeminately. Such accusations damaged reputation severely and required strong response to restore honour. Conversely, women who behaved too masculinely faced social criticism, though the consequences differed from those facing effeminate men. Women wearing masculine clothing or engaging in masculine activities risked social disapproval, though warrior women appear in saga accounts suggesting these gender expectations, while strong, weren't absolute. The figure of the shield maiden appears in saga literature, representing women who fought alongside or instead of engaging in typical feminine activities. The historical reality of shield maidens remains debated, but their presence in literature suggests that Norse culture could conceive of women in warrior roles, even if such women were rare in practice. Cross-gender accusations served as powerful insults. Calling a man feminine or suggesting he failed to fulfill masculine roles represented serious affronts requiring response. Similarly, accusing women of masculine behaviour or questioning their feminine virtues damaged reputations and created social problems. Magic and its relationship to gender created complex dynamics. Seda, a form of magic associated with prophecy and fate manipulation, was practiced primarily by women and by male practitioners who faced accusations of ergi. This association between certain magical practices and femininity created tension for men who possessed such abilities. The concept of enid, insulting poetry that attacked reputations, often included gender-based insults. Nid verses might accuse men of cowardice, effeminacy, or other failures of masculinity. Such verses, taken seriously in honour-focused culture, could escalate into feuds or violence. Homosexual activity, particularly the passive role for men, carried social stigma related to gender role expectations. The active partner in same-gender relationships faced less social censure than the passive partner, reflecting hierarchical understandings of gender roles that prioritise the active masculine principle. Women's same-gender relationships received less attention in surviving sources, suggesting either that they occurred less frequently, concerned society less, or simply interested male saga authors less. The relative silence makes firm conclusions difficult, though references exist suggesting such relationships occurred without necessarily carrying the same stigma as male same-gender relations. Widowhood affected gender roles significantly. Widows often assumed household headship responsibilities, typically held by men, managing property, making decisions and representing family interests. Capable widows could wield considerable authority, demonstrating the potential for gender role flexibility when circumstances required. Age modified gender expectations. Elderly women past childbearing, and elderly men past prime warrior years gained different social roles. Elderly women sometimes practiced magic with less stigma. Elderly men focused on wisdom and counsel rather than physical prowess. Age created spaces where gender expectations relaxed somewhat. Social status intersected with gender roles. Elite women enjoyed more authority and respect than poor women. Elite men faced higher expectations regarding honour and warrior prowess than poor men. Class thus mediated gender expectations, creating variations within overall patterns. The practical necessities of survival in harsh northern environments sometimes required flexibility in gender roles. When men died in warfare or trading voyages, women assumed masculine responsibilities. When women died in childbirth, men managed domestic tasks. Survival sometimes trumped gender norms. The integration of gender roles with honour culture meant that both men and women faced social pressure to conform to expected behaviours. Deviation risked not just personal shame, but family dishonour. This collective nature of honour created powerful incentives for gender role conformity. The evolution of gender roles over time reflected changing circumstances. The Viking Age's raiding culture emphasised masculine warrior identities. Later periods saw shifts as Scandinavia converted to Christianity and integrated into broader European political structures. These transitions gradually modified traditional gender expectations. Before formal marriage arrangements began, young people navigated social contexts where relationships might form within the constraints of family supervision and cultural expectations. Understanding these informal processes reveals how personal preferences developed within structured social systems. Public gatherings provided primary opportunities for unmarried individuals to interact. Seasonal festivals celebrating agricultural cycles, religious observances honouring gods, and community assemblies where legal and political matters were addressed, all brought people together in contexts where supervised interaction could occur. The Althing, Iceland's national assembly, exemplified such gathering. Families travelled from across Iceland to participate in legal proceedings, conduct trading, arrange marriages, and socialise. These gatherings, lasting weeks, provided extended opportunities for young people to become acquainted while families negotiated potential matches. Seasonal work activities including sheep roundups, harvest labour, and fishing expeditions created contexts where young people worked alongside each other. These supervised work settings allowed interaction while contributing productively to community needs. Relationships formed through shared labour experiences. Winter evening gatherings, when families visited each other's homes for entertainment and socialisation, provided another context for interaction. These gatherings involved storytelling, games, craft work, and conversation. Young people could interact under family supervision while contributing to household activities and entertainment. Athletic competitions and games provided opportunities for young men to demonstrate prowess, while young women observed. Wrestling, running, skiing, and various ball games allowed men to display physical abilities while establishing social hierarchies. Success in athletic competition enhanced masculine status. Dances and musical performances at festivals created more explicitly social contexts. While Norse dancing differed from later European dance traditions, sources reference dance and music at celebrations. These performances, involving both observers and participants, created atmospheres where social interaction flourished. Drinking parties and feasts, while often involving married adults primarily, sometimes included younger unmarried people. These social gatherings, lubricated by mead or ale, facilitated conversation and social bonding. The supervision typically present at such events prevented inappropriate behaviour while allowing interaction. Gift exchanges between young people signalled interest and intentions. Small carved objects, jewellery, or other tokens passed between individuals interested in each other. These gifts, while modest, carried social significance and began processes that might culminate in formal betrothal negotiations. Poetry served as medium for expressing romantic interest within culturally acceptable frameworks. Young men with poetic abilities might compose verses praising particular women. These poems, following traditional forms, allowed expression of personal preference while demonstrating skill valued in Norse culture. The role of women in indicating interest or acceptance required subtlety, given cultural expectations about feminine modesty. Women couldn't openly pursue relationships, but could signal receptivity through accepting gifts, permitting conversation, or through intermediaries who conveyed interest. These indirect methods allowed female agency within restrictive frameworks. Reputation management mattered enormously for unmarried individuals. Young women particularly needed to maintain reputations for modesty and appropriate behaviour. Any hint of impropriety could damage marriage prospects severely. Young men needed to demonstrate appropriate masculine qualities, including honour, competence, and self-control. Matchmaking by older family members, particularly mothers and other older women, facilitated relationship formation. These experienced women observed young people's interactions, assessed compatibility, and began informal discussions that might lead to formal negotiations. Their involvement protected propriety while allowing relationships to develop. Economic considerations influenced relationship formation even at early stages. Families assessed potential partners' economic prospects, property holdings, and family resources. Young people understood that family wealth and status would largely determine acceptable potential partners, regardless of personal preferences. Social status compatibility generally guided relationship formation. Families of similar status typically intermarried, maintaining and reinforcing social hierarchies. Relationships crossing significant status boundaries faced obstacles, though exceptional circumstances occasionally allowed such matches. Physical attraction, while not discussed explicitly in sources, undoubtedly influenced relationship formation. The emphasis on physical beauty in poetry and saga descriptions of admired individuals suggests that attractiveness mattered to ancient Scandinavians as to people across cultures and times. Shared interests and compatibility, to extent they could be assessed through limited interaction, influenced preferences. Young people who found conversation easy, who shared sense of humour, or who seemed temperamentally compatible might develop preferences for each other within limits set by family and social expectations. The long period between initial interest and marriage allowed relationships to develop gradually. Unlike modern dating, Norse courtship occurred over extended periods with increasing levels of family involvement. This gradual process allowed assessment of compatibility while maintaining social propriety. Secret meetings or unsupervised interaction carried serious risks. Young people discovered meeting privately risked scandal that could destroy marriage prospects and damage family honour. The social constraints against such behaviour served to protect reputations and maintain social order, though sources suggest violations occasionally occurred. Elopements, while rare, appear in saga accounts. Couples who faced family opposition to their relationship might elope, creating legal and social complications. Such elopements represented serious breaches of social norms and often resulted in family feuds or other conflicts requiring resolution. Premarital relationships, while officially discouraged, appear to have occurred with some frequency, based on legal provisions addressing children born before marriage. The existence of such laws suggests that Norse society pragmatically acknowledged that young people sometimes formed relationships before formal marriage, despite social expectations of premarital chastity. The integration of personal preference with family decision-making created tension that sources occasionally reference. Sagas preserve accounts of young people advocating for preferred partners or resisting family-arranged matches. While family interest ultimately determined most matches, these accounts suggest individual preferences weren't completely ignored. Once households formed through marriage, the bearing and raising of children represented central family purposes in Norse society. Understanding child-rearing practices illuminates cultural values, family dynamics, and the practical realities of childhood in ancient Scandinavia. Pregnancy, announced after it became obvious, brought families together in preparation for births. Experienced women, particularly mothers, and older female relatives, provided guidance to expectant mothers. The knowledge of pregnancy, childbirth, and infant care passed primarily through female family networks. Childbirth occurred at home with assistance from experienced women who served as midwives. These women, sometimes possessing specialized knowledge of herbs and practices, believed to ease labour, attended births, and provided crucial support during dangerous events. The mortality risks for both mothers and infants were significant. Religious practices surrounded childbirth. Women invoked goddesses associated with childbirth seeking divine protection. Charms and amulets provided spiritual protection. These religious observances reflected genuine anxieties about childbirth's dangers and the hope that divine intervention might prevent the worst outcomes. The moment of birth involved decisions that shaped children's futures profoundly. The father formally acknowledged and accepted children through specific ritual actions including sprinkling water and naming. This acceptance integrated children into families legally and socially. Conversely, fathers could refuse to accept children, leading to abandonment or exposure. Infant exposure, the practice of leaving unwanted infants to die of exposure, occurred in Norse society, though its frequency remains debated. Economic hardship, physical deformities, or doubts about paternity might lead families to expose infants. This practice, while shocking to modern sensibilities, reflected harsh realities of subsistence survival in difficult environment. Naming followed specific customs. Children received names that honoured ancestors, carried family significance, or reflected characteristics or circumstances of birth. Names connected children to family histories and traditions. The naming ceremony formally integrated children into family and community. Breastfeeding typically continued for several years. Mothers nursed children while resuming household duties as soon as health permitted after childbirth. Wet nurses, women who nursed others' children, served wealthy families or mothers unable to nurse. Extended breastfeeding provided nutrition and, while not understood in modern terms, some protection against disease. Infant care occupied mothers primarily, though older siblings and other family members assisted. Infants needed constant attention, feeding, cleaning, and protection. The demands of infant care occurred alongside women's continuing household responsibilities, requiring efficient time management and family cooperation. Young children remained primarily in women's domestic spheres. Toddlers played near their mothers as women worked, learning through observation and beginning to help with simple tasks. This constant proximity allowed transmission of practical knowledge while keeping children safe under supervision. The transition from infancy to childhood occurred gradually. Children gained increasing independence, took on age-appropriate responsibilities, and spent more time with same-age peers. These transitions weren't marked by formal ceremonies, but occurred naturally as children matured and demonstrated readiness for greater responsibility. Play served important functions in child development. Children played games that developed physical skills, practiced adult activities through imitation, and socialized with peers. Toys included carved animals, small boats, dolls, and other simple objects. Play occurred within contexts of household work, not as completely separate activity. Education began early, and occurred primarily through apprenticeship within families. Boys learned masculine skills working alongside fathers and other male relatives. Girls learned feminine skills working alongside mothers and other women. This apprenticeship system transmitted knowledge essential for adult life. Storytelling served educational functions beyond entertainment. Children heard saga recitations that taught history, values, and cultural knowledge. Riddles and word games developed verbal skills. Poetry and song transmission preserved oral traditions. These narrative traditions shaped children's understanding of their culture. Religious education occurred through participation in household and community observances. Children learned prayers, participated in sacrifices, and absorbed religious worldviews through observation and gradual participation. This religious education integrated spiritual understanding with practical knowledge about rituals and proper behaviour. Discipline maintained order and taught proper behaviour. Parents used various disciplinary methods ranging from verbal correction to physical punishment when deemed necessary. The extent and severity of discipline varied by family, but maintenance of household order and proper behaviour required that parents address misbehaviour. Coming-of-age transitions marked movements toward adulthood. While Norse society lacked single formal coming-of-age ceremonies, various markers indicated maturation. Boys' first weapons, girls' first adult clothing, assumption of adult responsibilities, and physical maturation all signalled progression toward adult status. Adolescence, a period of transition between childhood and full adulthood, involved increasing responsibilities and independence. Teenagers worked alongside adults performing increasingly complex tasks. Young men might accompany fathers on trading voyages. Young women assumed greater household management responsibilities. This period prepared them for eventual full adult status. Betrothal negotiations typically began when young people reached appropriate ages, generally late teens or early 20s. Parents assessed when children reached sufficient maturity for marriage, considering physical, emotional, and economic readiness. The transition to marriage marked full adult status. Sibling relationships shaped childhood experiences significantly. Older siblings helped care for younger ones, taught skills, and provided companionship. Birth order affected inheritances and social status. These sibling bonds, formed in childhood, often remained important throughout lives. Half-siblings and step-siblings were common given mortality, divorce, and remarriage rates. Blended families navigated complex dynamics, as children from multiple relationships coexisted in households. Legal frameworks addressed these complexities, particularly regarding inheritance, but daily navigation of blended family relationships required tact and flexibility. Fostering, the practice of sending children to be raised by other families, served multiple purposes. Foster relationships created bonds between families, provided children with broader networks, and allowed parents to forge alliances. fostered children maintained ties to biological families while gaining additional family connections through foster relationships. Adoption occurred less commonly than fostering, but existed in cases where couples lacked children or where children needed families. Adopted children gained legal status as family members and could inherit, though sometimes with restrictions compared to biological children. Childhood mortality rates, high by modern standards, meant that many children died before reaching adulthood. Diseases, accidents, malnutrition, and harsh environmental conditions all threatened young lives. Parents faced the grief of lost children with tragic frequency. Archaeological evidence of child burials with grave goods reveals the emotional investment parents made in children. The transition from childhood to adulthood prepared young people for assuming full responsibilities of adult life. By the time individuals married and established households, they possessed extensive practical knowledge and skills necessary for survival. This knowledge, transmitted through family-based education, ensured cultural continuity across generations. While marriage represented a major social institution in Norse society, the relative ease of divorce compared to Christian medieval Europe meant that marriages sometimes ended before death of spouses. Understanding divorce and remarriage provides important perspective on Norse family life. The grounds for divorce, as mentioned earlier, were varied and could be initiated by either spouse. This bilateral access to divorce represented unusual arrangement for medieval period and reflected Norse pragmatism about marriage as social contract that should be terminable when it failed. Women's right to divorce included specific grounds that reveal cultural values. A woman could divorce her husband if he demonstrated effeminacy through clothing choices or behaviour, if he failed to provide adequate support, if he showed cowardice that dishonoured the family, or if he committed serious insults to her or her family. Men's grounds for divorce similarly reflected cultural priorities. Men could divorce wives for adultery, which threatened certain knowledge of paternity. They could divorce women who wore masculine clothing or behaved inappropriately masculinely. Incompatibility and failure to fulfill marital duties also constituted grounds. The divorce process required formal declaration before witnesses. The spouse initiating divorce announced intentions publicly, typically at the couple's home door or at a public assembly. This public announcement ensured community knowledge and prevented later disputes about whether divorce had actually occurred. The witnesses to divorce declarations played crucial roles. Their presence ensured legal validity and allowed them to testify about the divorce's occurrence and terms if later disputes arose. Respected community members serving as witnesses gave weight to proceedings and protected both parties' interests. Property division following divorce followed the terms established at marriage. Women reclaimed their heimanfylgja and received back the munda their husband had paid at marriage. Men retained property they brought to marriage and goods acquired during it that weren't part of the wife's property. Clear property separation facilitated relatively clean divorces. Children's custody and support represented more complex issues. Young children typically remained with mothers, who were considered essential for their care. Older children, particularly boys, might live with fathers. Fathers remained obligated to provide financial support regardless of custody arrangements. The stigma around divorce varied by circumstances. Divorces for serious causes that reflected badly on one party created shame for that individual. Divorces by mutual agreement or for reasons that didn't reflect badly on either party carried less stigma. The community judgment depended largely on perceived justification. Remarriage after divorce occurred commonly and faced no legal barriers once divorce was finalised. Both men and women typically remarried relatively quickly, given the practical necessities of household management. Second marriages followed similar procedures to first marriages, though sometimes with less elaborate celebrations. Widowhood affected women and men differently. Widows gained independence unusual for women in medieval societies. They controlled property, managed households, made decisions about remarriage, and sometimes wielded considerable influence. This autonomy lasted only until remarriage, which transferred authority to new husbands. The mourning period following a spouse's death varied by circumstances but typically lasted weeks to months. During mourning, the bereaved wore specific clothing, limited participation in celebrations, and observed other customs marking their grieving state. These mourning customs acknowledged loss while gradually preparing individuals for return to normal life. Remarriage for widows and widowers followed similar procedures to first marriages, though sometimes with less family involvement. Adults who had been married could make more autonomous decisions about subsequent marriages. Their experience and established positions gave them more agency than young people marrying for first times. Children's relationships with step-parents created complex family dynamics. Step-parents assumed parenting responsibilities, but legal relationships between step-parents and stepchildren differed from those between biological parents and children. Inheritance rights particularly required careful navigation in blended families. The frequency of remarriage meant that many households included children from multiple marriages. These blended families required careful negotiation of relationships, resources, and emotional bonds. Successful blended families created networks of kin relationships that extended family connections widely. Conflicts between ex-spouses sometimes continued after divorce. Property disputes, child support conflicts, or simple ongoing hostility could strain relationships years after divorce. These conflicts sometimes required community intervention or thing judgment to resolve. The children of divorced parents maintained relationships with both parents typically, though this varied by circumstances. Children whose parents remained in the same community could maintain regular contact with both. Those whose divorced parents lived far apart might see one parent infrequently, creating challenges for maintaining relationships. The remarriage of parents created situations where children gained step-siblings and step-parents, while maintaining relationships with biological parents. These complex family networks required flexibility and accommodation from all parties. Successful navigation of these relationships contributed to social stability. Multiple divorces and remarriages, while less common than single marriages or one remarriage, did occur. Individuals who divorced and remarried multiple times gained reputations that could be positive if circumstances justified divorces, or negative if patterns suggested inability to maintain successful marriages. The elderly who outlived multiple spouses faced unique circumstances. These individuals, having experienced multiple marriages and accumulated extensive family networks through marriages and children, occupied complex positions in family and social structures. Their experience and connections often made them important family and community figures. The property accumulated through multiple marriages could be substantial for both men and women. Individuals who inherited from multiple deceased spouses or retained property through divorces might become wealthy. This wealth accumulation through serial marriages provided economic security and social status. The emotional dimensions of divorce and remarriage receive little direct attention in sources focused primarily on legal and economic aspects. However, the human emotions of grief, disappointment, hope, and affection surely influence these life transitions as they do across cultures. The source's silence on emotions doesn't mean people didn't experience them. Religion permeated Norse life, including relationships, marriage, and family formation. Understanding the religious dimensions of intimate practices reveals how ancient Scandinavians integrated spiritual beliefs with practical social arrangements. The Norse pantheon included several deities particularly associated with love, fertility, marriage, and family. Freya, most prominently, governed love and fertility. Women particularly invoked her seeking assistance with fertility, successful childbirth, and happy marriages. Her worship involved both public cult activities and private devotions. Freya's brother, similarly governed fertility, but with more emphasis on agricultural abundance and male fertility. Couples might invoke both deities seeking their blessings for fruitful marriages producing both children and material prosperity. The connection between human and agricultural fertility in these deities' portfolios reflected the agricultural basis of Norse society. Frigg, wife of Odin, represented married women's interests in domestic order. As queen of the gods and matron of households, Frigg embodied the ideals of the effective housewife. Women sought her favour in household management and child-rearing efforts. Odin and Thor, while not primarily associated with fertility or marriage, received worship from married couples seeking protection, prosperity, and success in various endeavours. The major gods' cults included people across society regardless of marital status. The Vanir, the divine family to which Freya and Freya belonged, were particularly associated with fertility. The Vanir cults emphasized life-giving powers, abundance, and prosperity. marriages and households particularly aligned with Vanir worship, given these deities' connections to fertility and prosperity. Sacrifices marked important life transitions, including marriages. Wedding ceremonies typically included sacrifices to appropriate deities seeking divine blessing for the union. These sacrifices, involving valuable animals or other goods, demonstrated families' investments in ensuring divine favour. Household shrines maintained ongoing relationships with protective spirits and deities. Families made regular offerings at these shrines, seeking continued protection and prosperity. The housewife typically oversaw these household religious observances, reflecting women's central roles in domestic religious practices. The Dizir, female protective spirits connected to family lineages, received worship particularly from women. These spirits, thought to protect family members and ensure fertility, were honoured through sacrifices and invocations. The Disir represented connections between living families and ancestral spirits. Ancestors received worship and reverence as sources of blessing and protection for living descendants. Families maintained connections to deceased relatives through remembrance, offerings, and invocation during important events. Ancestral worship reinforced family identity and continuity across generations. Protective spirits associated with households, called landvetir or similar terms, required appeasement through offerings. These spirits, thought to inhabit the land where families lived, could bless or curse households. Maintaining good relationships with these spirits formed part of household religious obligations. Magic, particularly Seder, played roles in relationship formation and maintenance. While controversial given Seder's association with ergi for male practitioners, magic might be employed to attract romantic interests, ensure fertility, protect pregnancies, or address various other concerns related to relationships and family. Love magic appears in various sources, though whether these represent historical practices or literary tropes remains debated. References to magical practices designed to attract specific individuals or ensure their affections suggest that at least some ancient Scandinavians believed such magic possible and potentially employed it. Fertility magic addressed concerns about conception, successful pregnancy, and healthy childbirth. Various charms, rituals, and practices aimed to promote fertility existed in Norse tradition. Women particularly employed these magical practices given their central roles in reproduction. Protective magic safeguarded children, pregnant women, and families. Amulets, carved symbols, and various rituals sought to ward off harmful influences and ensure family members' safety. These protective practices reflected genuine anxieties about dangers facing families in harsh northern environment. Prophecy and fate played important roles in Norse religious worldview. Consultation with seers or practitioners of Seder might inform marriage decisions, provide guidance about children's futures, or address other family concerns. Belief in fate meant that divine forces influenced family fortunes beyond human control. Christian conversion transformed Norse religious landscape gradually over several centuries. The integration of Christianity created hybrid practices, combining traditional Norse customs with Christian elements. Marriages began receiving church blessings, Christian prayers replaced pagan ones, and Christian concepts about marriage gradually modified Norse traditions. The Christianization's impact on intimate practices was profound but gradual. Christian prohibitions on divorce conflicted with Norse legal traditions. Christian sexual ethics differed from Norse practices. The transition created tensions between traditional customs and new religious requirements that took generations to fully resolve. The preservation of pre-Christian customs, even after nominal conversion, meant that hybrid practices persisted for extended periods. Weddings might receive both church blessings and traditional Norse ceremonies. Christian prayers might be offered alongside invocations of traditional protective spirits. This syncretism characterized the transition period. The eventual triumph of Christianity eliminated official pagan worship, but didn't necessarily erase all traditional beliefs and practices. Folk customs preserving pre-Christian elements persisted, sometimes for centuries, in modified forms that were nominally Christian but retained earlier traditions' influences. Religious belief provided meaning and comfort regarding intimate relationships and family life. Whether through pagan tradition or Christianity, ancient Scandinavians understood their relationships as connected to divine forces and spiritual realities beyond mere human arrangements. This religious dimension added depth to intimate practices and family formation. social hierarchies profoundly influenced intimate relationships and family formation in Norse society. Understanding these status dimensions reveals how class and rank shaped personal relationships and domestic arrangements. The three main social classes, jarls, nobles, carls, free farmers, and thralls, enslaved people, experienced intimate relationships very differently. Legal rights, economic resources, social expectations, and practical circumstances all varied based on social status. Jarls, the elite nobility, married primarily within their own class or allied with foreign nobility. Their marriages served political purposes, creating alliances between powerful families or regions. Personal compatibility mattered less than political and economic considerations. Elite marriages involved elaborate ceremonies, substantial bride prices and dowries, and extensive political implications. The households of jarls reflected their status through size and complexity. Large halls housed extended families, retainers, servants, and enslaved workers. Multiple buildings served specialized functions. The domestic arrangements of elite households differed fundamentally from those of common farmers. Elite women, while still operating within patriarchal frameworks, wielded more authority than common women. They managed large households with many workers, controlled substantial resources, and sometimes exercised political influence. Their literacy levels often exceeded those of common women, and their participation in cultural activities like poetry was more extensive. Elite men's access to multiple relationships, whether through polygyny or concubinage, created complex household dynamics. Elite households might include multiple women connected romantically to the household head, along with their children, creating intricate networks of relationships and potential conflicts. Carls, the free farming class comprising Norse society's majority, married primarily within similar social and economic levels. Their marriages balanced practical considerations about household formation, with some room for personal preferences. Carl marriages involved significant economic exchanges, but on scales manageable for farming families. Carl households centred on longhouses housing nuclear families, sometimes with unmarried relatives or elderly parents. These households were largely self-sufficient economic units, producing most of their own necessities. The domestic labour of both spouses was essential to household survival. Common women managed households, produced textiles, processed food, and contributed essential labour to family survival. While they lacked elite women's resources and authority, within their own households they wielded significant practical power over daily affairs. Common men worked as farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, or traders. Their status derived from productive labour, household management, and maintenance of honour within their communities. Success in these domains earned respect even without elite social status. The marriage market for commoners involved more limited choices than for elite families. Geographic proximity, limited social networks, and practical considerations about economic compatibility constrained options. Most people married neighbours or individuals from nearby communities, rather than seeking spouses from distant regions. Thralls, enslaved people, lacked legal rights to marriage or family formation. Their intimate relationships, if they occurred, carried no legal recognition. Children born to thralls were themselves thralls, owned by their mothers' owners. The denial of family rights represented slavery's cruel nature. Relationships between free persons and thralls violated social norms and created legal complexities. Children from such unions occupied ambiguous positions. If fathers acknowledged them, they might gain freedom and limited rights. If not, they remained enslaved. These mixed-status relationships were discouraged, but apparently occurred. Manumission, the freeing of thralls, sometimes resulted from relationships between owners and enslaved workers. Masters might free women who bore their children, or long-time servants with whom they'd developed attachments. However, manumission remained relatively uncommon, and at owners' discretion. Freed thralls, called freedmen or freedwomen, occupied intermediate status between thralls and freeborn persons. They could marry legally and form families, though social stigma and economic disadvantages often persisted. Their children, however, were freeborn and could eventually integrate fully into free society. Social mobility affected relationship possibilities. Men who gained wealth through trading or raiding could marry into higher social levels than birth status alone would permit. Women from families experiencing economic hardship might marry into lower social levels than their birth status suggested. Wealth and status weren't entirely fixed. The concept of genealogy and family reputation influenced relationship formation significantly. Families with distinguished ancestors and good reputations married other reputable families. Those with scandal in family histories faced prejudice. Family reputation affected individual marriage prospects across generations. Foreign relationships occurred through trading connections, raiding, and Norse expansion. Norsemen settling in Ireland, England, or other regions sometimes married local women, creating mixed cultural families. These international marriages created cultural bridges, but also sometimes tensions between Norse and local identities. The children of mixed cultural unions navigated complex identities. Raised in households combining Norse and other traditions, they inherited from multiple cultural backgrounds. Their experiences varied widely based on specific circumstances and which aspects of their heritage they emphasized. Status considerations extended to choices of lovers and informal relationships. While formal marriage required status compatibility, less formal relationships might cross class boundaries more easily. However, maintaining relationships across significant status divides created practical difficulties. The relationship between status and intimate happiness remains largely unknowable from surviving sources. Whether elite marriages of political convenience created happiness or misery, whether common couples enjoyed fulfilling partnerships, or whether enslaved people found solace in relationships despite bondage, these emotional question sources rarely address directly. Norse intimate practices didn't remain static but evolved across the several centuries of the Viking Age and into the medieval period. Understanding these changes reveals how cultures adapt while maintaining continuity. The early Viking Age, approximately 800 to 900 CE, saw traditional pagan practices at their height. Marriage customs, gender roles, and family structures reflected traditions developed over centuries. The religious framework supporting these practices remained unquestioned in most Norse territories. The expansion period, approximately 900 to 1000 CE, brought Norse people into contact with diverse cultures through raiding, trading, and settlement. These contacts influenced practices as Norse peoples encountered and sometimes adopted foreign customs. Marriages between Norse and foreign partners created multicultural families. The conversion period, approximately 950 to 1100 CE, witnessed gradual Christianization that fundamentally transformed Norse society. The conversion occurred at different times and paces across regions, but eventually encompassed all Norse territories. Christianity's impact on intimate practices was profound. Church opposition to traditional Norse divorce practices created conflicts. Christian doctrine held marriage to be permanent sacrament dissoluble only by death. This contradicted Norse legal traditions, allowing relatively easy divorce. The resulting tension took generations to resolve, with Christian standards eventually prevailing. Christian sexual ethics differed from traditional Norse practices. Christianity emphasized sexual activity's restriction to marriage and reproductive purposes. Traditional Norse attitudes appear to have been more pragmatic, though sources don't explicitly articulate sexual ethics. The Christian influence gradually modified behaviour and social expectations. Clerical celibacy, required for priests under Christian discipline, represented concept foreign to Norse tradition, where religious specialists typically married and had families. The requirement that Christian priests remain unmarried puzzled many Norse converts, for whom religious authority and family life naturally connected. The sacralization of marriage through Christian ceremony added layers of religious meaning beyond traditional Norse legal contract. Marriage became religious sacrament with theological significance, not just social contract. This transformation fundamentally altered how marriage was understood. Monogamy became strict requirement under Christian teaching, eliminating any acceptance of polygyny or concubinage. Men who had maintained multiple relationships found themselves required to formalize one relationship and dissolve others. This transition created disruption and hardship. Gender roles evolved under Christian influence. Christian teachings about proper feminine behavior emphasized different virtues than traditional Norse culture. The Virgin Mary as feminine ideal presented image quite different from Freya or other Norse goddesses. These changing ideals gradually modified expectations. The writing of law codes during conversion and post-conversion periods preserved some traditional customs, while modifying others to align with Christian requirements. These written codes replacing earlier oral traditions, show the negotiation between traditional practice and Christian influence. Women's status underwent complex changes during Christianization. Some historians argue Christianity reduced women's relative autonomy by eliminating divorce rights and emphasizing patriarchal authority. Others note that Christianity's emphasis on marriage's sacredness and prohibitions on concubinage protected wives' positions. The literacy that came with Christianity, primarily located in monasteries and churches initially, created new roles for educated individuals in documenting and interpreting customs. The saga literature preserving knowledge of earlier practices was written by Christian authors looking back on pagan past, creating complex relationship between tradition and innovation. Feudalization, the gradual adoption of feudal social structures during medieval period, modified traditional Norse social organization. The clear class distinctions of earlier periods became more elaborate hierarchies. Elite families developed more complex aristocratic identities, affecting marriage patterns and family structures. Urbanization increased during later medieval period as trading towns grew into cities. Urban life created different social contexts than rural farming communities. Marriage patterns, household structures, and family dynamics adapted to urban conditions. Economic changes, including increased trade, craft specialization, and monetary economy, affected intimate practices. Marriage became increasingly embedded in economic networks beyond simple agricultural household formation. Dowries and bride prices became more complex financial transactions. Legal centralization as royal authority strengthened modified traditional thing system. Kings increasingly claimed authority over matters previously handled locally. This centralization affected family law as royal courts gained jurisdiction over marriage and family disputes. The Crusades and other military campaigns drew Norwegian, Swedish, and Danish participants into broader European military culture. These contacts influenced gender roles, concepts of masculinity, and ideas about appropriate behaviour for Christian warriors. The Black Death, 1347 to 1353, devastated Scandinavian populations, causing massive social disruption. The demographic catastrophe affected marriage patterns, inheritance practices, and family structures. Labour shortages modified social relationships as surviving workers gained leverage. The Kalmar Union, 1397 to 1523, uniting Norway, Sweden, and Denmark under single monarchy, created larger political unit promoting some cultural standardization. Royal authority and church influence combined to enforce more uniform practices across region. The Protestant Reformation reached Scandinavia in the 16th century, creating new religious transformations. Lutheran Christianity replaced Catholicism, bringing different attitudes toward marriage, sexuality, and family life. Clerical marriage became permitted, and divorce under certain conditions returned, though in modified forms. The transition from Viking Age through medieval period into early modern era thus saw enormous changes in intimate practices. Traditional Norse customs evolved, sometimes gradually and sometimes through traumatic transformations, into medieval Scandinavian Christian practices that differed substantially while maintaining some continuities. Understanding Norse intimate practices benefits from comparison with contemporary societies, an examination of how Norse customs fit into broader medieval European contexts while maintaining distinctive characteristics. The Norse practices differed significantly from Christian European societies where church influence dominated intimate relationships and family formation. The relative ease of Norse divorce contrasted sharply with Christian insistence on marriage's indissolubility. This difference represented fundamental cultural divergence. Roman legal traditions that influenced much of medieval Europe left little mark on Norse law, which developed independently from Germanic tribal customs. The Norse legal emphasis on oral tradition, local thing assemblies, and practical rather than abstract jurisprudence differed from Roman-influenced legal systems. Islamic societies, with which Norse peoples had trading contacts through eastern routes, maintained their own distinct approaches to marriage, including polygyny, different divorce procedures, and specific rules about women's status. While direct influences were minimal, the existence of alternative systems reminds us that medieval practices varied widely. The Celtic societies of Ireland and Scotland, with which Norse settlers interacted extensively, maintained their own marriage and family customs. The integration of Norse and Celtic traditions in areas of Norse settlement created hybrid practices drawing from both traditions. Anglo-Saxon England, before Norse influence, had Germanic customs sharing some similarities with Norse practices given common ancestral traditions. The Anglo-Saxon emphasis on family and kinship groups, bride prices and legal frameworks showed parallels to Norse systems while differing in specifics. The comparison with later medieval Scandinavian practices reveals how much changed during Christianization and feudalization. The relative freedom of Norse women compared to later medieval Christian European women suggests that Christianization may have reduced some aspects of women's autonomy. The differences between Norse and other medieval European gender roles stand out in comparative perspective. Norse women's rights to divorce, property ownership, and household authority exceeded those of many medieval European women. These differences reflected different cultural values and legal traditions. The acceptance of children born outside formal marriage in Norse society contrasted with Christian emphasis on legitimacy. While Norse society preferred legitimate offspring, children of less formal unions faced less stigma than in Christian Europe. This difference reflected different underlying assumptions about marriage and family. The comparison with contemporary non-European societies practicing similar lifestyles reveals both universal patterns and Norse distinctiveness. Steppe nomads, Arctic peoples, and others living in similar environments developed some parallel practices while maintaining cultural distinctiveness. The anthropological perspective on Norse practices reveals how cultures adapt intimate relationship patterns to environmental and economic conditions. The harsh northern climate, agricultural limitations, and seasonal extremes shaped practices in ways that made sense for their contexts. The longhouse's evolution from earlier Germanic structures through distinctively Norse forms into later Scandinavian buildings shows cultural continuity amid change. The domestic architecture both reflected and shaped how families organised their intimate and social lives. The comparison between Iceland's relatively democratic social structure and mainland Scandinavia's more hierarchical systems shows how geography and settlement patterns affected social organisation, including family and marriage patterns. The status of women in Norse society compared favourably to their status in many contemporary societies. While Norse society was patriarchal, and women faced significant restrictions, comparative perspective shows Norse women enjoyed more rights than women in many medieval societies. The concept of honour that dominated Norse social relationships found parallels in Mediterranean honour cultures while differing in specifics. The particular ways Norse people understood and performed honour reflected their distinctive cultural values. The role of hospitality in Norse culture paralleled its importance in many traditional societies, where showing generosity to guests created and maintained crucial social networks. The particular Norse emphasis on generous hospitality reflected values about appropriate behaviour and social relationships. The integration of magical practices with more mundane aspects of intimate relationships occurred in most traditional societies. The specific forms Norse magic took, particularly Seder, had distinctive characteristics while serving similar social functions as magic in other cultures. The religious understanding of intimate relationships as involving divine forces paralleled beliefs in other traditional religious systems. The particular Norse gods and their attributes differed from other pantheons while serving similar functions in providing meaning and seeking divine favour. The literacy transition from oral to written culture affected how intimate practices were understood and transmitted. The saga literature, written during Christian period about pagan past, created specific perspective on earlier practices that may or may not accurately represent historical reality. The comparison across time within Scandinavian history reveals remarkable changes from Viking Age through medieval period into early modern era. Yet certain continuities persisted, suggesting that some fundamental cultural patterns showed resilience despite enormous religious and political transformations. As this journey through the intimate practices of ancient Nordic peoples reaches its conclusion, the complexity and sophistication of Norse social life becomes clear. These were not barbaric raiders, but people with rich cultural traditions, sophisticated legal systems, and nuanced approaches to fundamental human questions about relationships and family. The legal framework structuring relationships in Norse society balanced individual rights with family interests, provided mechanisms for both forming and dissolving marriages, and protected property rights in ways that offered some protection to women unusual for medieval period. These legal traditions reflected cultural values emphasising honour, practical justice, and social order. The marriage customs and wedding traditions combined legal contract with religious observance and community celebration. Weddings served multiple functions beyond simply uniting couples. They created family alliances, transferred property, entertained communities, and marked important life transitions. The elaborate nature of Norse weddings reflected marriage's social importance. The household formation and domestic life organised around the longhouse created spaces where families lived, worked, and maintained their places in social hierarchies. The gender division of labour, while clear in principle, showed practical flexibility. Both men's and women's work proved essential to household survival. The gender roles and expectations, while distinct and enforced through powerful honour culture, showed some flexibility in practice. Women's domestic authority was real, even within patriarchal structures. Men's honour culture created pressures that shaped behaviour profoundly. Both genders navigated complex social expectations. The religious dimensions infused intimate practices with meaning beyond mere social convention. Whether invoking Freya for fertility, seeking ancestors' blessings, or later adapting to Christian frameworks, ancient Scandinavians understood their relationships as connected to divine forces and spiritual realities. The social status considerations shaped relationship possibilities profoundly. Elite and common people lived very different lives with different options and constraints. Enslaved people faced complete denial of family rights. These status differences revealed social hierarchies' power in shaping personal lives. The regional variations and cultural diversity within broader Norse world remind us that Viking culture encompassed significant variety. Norwegian, Swedish, Danish, and Icelandic practices showed variations. Settlement areas developed hybrid traditions. This diversity existed within common cultural framework. The changing practices over time revealed dynamic culture adapting to new circumstances. The Christianization particularly transformed many traditional practices. The gradual evolution from Viking Age pagan society into medieval Christian Scandinavia represented enormous cultural transformation. The material culture and daily realities grounded abstract discussions in concrete physical world. The objects people used, the spaces they inhabited, and the material conditions they navigated shaped how they lived intimate relationships and family lives. The comparisons and context situated Norse practices within broader medieval world while highlighting their distinctiveness. Understanding what made Norse culture unique and what it shared with contemporary societies illuminates both Norse specificity and universal human patterns. The legacy and historical memory extending from Norse period through subsequent centuries shows how cultures evolve while maintaining some continuities. The modern fascination with Viking Age reflects enduring interest in this remarkable culture. For contemporary students of history, the intimate practices of ancient Nordic peoples offer windows into dramatically different ways of organising fundamental aspects of human life. The legal frameworks, gender roles, religious beliefs and social structures differed profoundly from modern arrangements, while addressing timeless human needs. The ancient Norse peoples who lived, loved, raised families, and navigated social expectations in harsh northern landscapes left behind rich material and textual evidence illuminating their lives. Through careful scholarship combining archaeology, literary analysis and historical methodology, we can reconstruct much about how they approached intimate relationships, despite the centuries separating us. Thank you for joining this exploration of intimate practices among ancient Nordic peoples. May the insights gained provide understanding of historical realities while illuminating the diversity of human social organisation across times and cultures. Until next time, rest well.